Princess Anne had opened countless royal files without hesitation, but this one made her stop breathing. Beneath a black ribbon lay Prince Philip's sealed decree, bearing his private mark, and one devastating instruction. Camilla was to be permanently denied access to his personal archives, private rooms, ceremonial possessions, and protected family records. Anne read the order twice. Then she stood, closed the folder, and demanded that Camilla be brought to her immediately. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne entered the restricted records room at Windsor Castle expecting papers, not a message from the grave. A senior archivist placed a folder before her and explained that only Philip's eldest daughter or the reigning sovereign could break its seal. The archive held documents outside palace access because they belonged to his private estate, meaning property and records he had controlled himself. Anne cut the ribbon. Philip's signature waited. The decree removed Camilla's access to Philip's confidential correspondence, former apartments, ceremonial collection, papers, and every record tied to his legacy. A royal decree was a formal written command carrying its issuer's authority, and this one named Anne as enforcer. She pressed the page. Her face hardened, but the pain beneath it was unmistakable. Philip had expected resistance. He had also expected his daughter to confront it. Camilla was midway through a private briefing when an equerry delivered Anne's summons. An equerry was a royal officer who carried messages for the royal family. The queen consort heard the danger at once. The message offered no courtesy, no explanation, and no delay. She asked whether Charles had seen the document. The officer lowered his eyes and answered, "The Princess Royal is waiting." Camilla dismissed the room and walked toward the archive. Anne kept reading. Beneath Philip's signature, a handwritten warning stopped her cold. This restriction protects more than property. The words suggested a hidden confidence, a family truth, or danger to the crown. Then the second page revealed the shock. Philip had placed final authority with Anne rather than Charles, so the command could survive marriage and royal pressure. Anne closed the folder, slid it across the table, and ordered every door connected to Philip's collection locked. Footsteps sounded beyond the corridor. She remained standing in silence. Camilla was coming, and Anne had decided that courtesy would not weaken her father's final command. But before Camilla crossed that threshold, the decree had already exposed something far more dangerous than a dispute over access. It had placed Philip's daughter, Charles's wife, and the king himself on opposing sides of one final command. This was not simply Anne against Camilla. It was a collision between a daughter protecting her father, a wife defending her place beside the king, and a monarch trapped between blood and marriage. Each entered the crisis carrying years of resentment, loyalty, and unspoken fear. Yet only one of them possessed Prince Philip's written authority, and Anne knew that once she invoked it, their family relationships might never recover. Anne had always understood her father in a way few others did. Philip valued discipline, directness, and the courage to endure disapproval without retreat. He never treated his daughter as a decorative figure standing at the edge of royal life. He trusted her with difficult duties, expected her to speak plainly, and believed she could carry responsibility without seeking praise. That was why his private legacy felt sacred to her. The sealed decree was not merely a document. It was a final burden placed in the hands of the child he believed would not bend. Camilla had fought a different battle. She had spent years turning public tolerance into acceptance, and acceptance into authority. Becoming queen consort, the title given to the wife of a reigning king, had brought her closer to the center of the monarchy. But Philip's collection represented something deeper. Access to his letters, possessions, and private assessments would mean entry into the family's protected memory. Without it, she could hold a crown and still remain outside one of its most guarded rooms. Anne stood beside the folder and remembered a conversation from years earlier. Philip had told her that duty sometimes meant being disliked by the right people. The words returned with brutal force. She did not feel honored. She felt wounded. Her father had foreseen a conflict serious enough to divide his children, and he had knowingly left the emotional cost to her. Camilla continued down the corridor, adjusting the bracelet at her wrist as she fought to control her expression. Losing access would be painful, but the deeper humiliation was unmistakable. Philip had distrusted her, and he had preserved that distrust beyond death in a form that no title, charm, or marriage could erase. Charles received the warning in his private office. A courtier informed him through a documented palace briefing that Anne had opened a sealed instruction concerning his wife. The king set down his pen and asked whether Philip's signature had been authenticated. When told that it had, he closed his eyes. He already understood that his father had reached into the present with one final act of control. The collection contained correspondence involving Queen Elizabeth, private family judgments, notes on future royal roles, and personal objects never meant for ordinary household access. That made Camilla's exclusion more than personal. It touched history, legitimacy, and the monarchy's control over its own past. Camilla stopped outside the door and adjusted her bracelet for the third time. Inside, Anne remained standing beside the decree. Neither woman offered a greeting. The silence lasted long enough for the queen consort to understand that this was not a negotiation about protocol. It was a judgment about belonging, and behind that silence lay a history neither woman could escape. Because Philip's decree had not been written in sudden anger. It had been triggered by one precise incident that convinced him the boundary had to become permanent. The decree began years earlier, during a private memorial dinner at Sandringham, when one seemingly minor request changed Philip's view of Camilla forever. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, yet those present never forgot the way his expression altered. By the end of that evening, he had stopped treating her curiosity as harmless. Within 48 hours, Philip summoned his solicitor and began drafting the restriction Anne would one day uncover. Philip had always guarded certain parts of his life with absolute care. Inside a locked cabinet at Sandringham rested letters exchanged with Queen Elizabeth during painful periods of their marriage, handwritten notes about royal crises, private judgments of family members, and documents he believed should remain under blood family protection. Sandringham was the royal family's private country estate, meaning it belonged to their personal world rather than the public machinery of the crown. To him, that cabinet was not an archive, it was a boundary. Camilla learned about it almost by accident. During preparations for the memorial dinner, she overheard two senior staff members discussing the cabinet and its importance to future biographical records. A biographical record was material that could later shape how a person's life was officially remembered. She understood at once what those papers could contain. They might influence how history judged Philip, Elizabeth, Charles, and her own place beside him. Camilla entered the library after dinner and made the request directly. She asked Philip to release selected letters about Charles's early adulthood, arguing that they could help correct misunderstandings before those misunderstandings became permanent history. Philip did not answer immediately. He removed his glasses, placed them on the desk, and asked whether Charles knew she was making the request. Camilla avoided the question. That hesitation changed everything. Philip's voice turned cold. He told her that private family pain was not material to be selected, arranged, or softened for anyone's protection, including his son's. She answered that she had spent years being judged by fragments of the past and deserved to understand the records shaping that judgment. He refused. Marriage to Charles, he said, did not open every private chamber of the family. Anne saw the aftermath minutes later. Camilla left the corridor with her jaw tight and her hands still. The Princess Royal then found her father locking the cabinet himself. He offered only one warning. Some doors must remain closed even when people acquire new titles. The next morning, Philip instructed his private secretary, the official responsible for managing his confidential affairs, to contact a solicitor and prepare a sealed legal decree. 48 hours later, Anne stood beside him as witness. Philip covered the pages before she could read them, pressed his seal into dark wax, and told her that one day she might have to choose between family peace and family protection. Years later, standing opposite Camilla with that same seal now broken, Anne understood that Philip's warning had finally become her command, and the confrontation he predicted was about to begin. Camilla entered expecting a difficult conversation. She found Anne waiting with a verdict. The decree lay between them, Philip's signature visible beneath the broken seal, and there were no aides present to soften what followed. Camilla reached for the document. Anne placed one hand over it and said, "You will not touch this until you understand what it says." In that instant, courtesy vanished, rank became irrelevant, and years of tension finally spoke aloud. Anne dismissed the equerry with a single look, and closed the records room door herself. An equerry was a royal officer assigned to carry messages and assist senior members of the family, but no such protection would remain inside that room. No secretary would rephrase the anger, no legal advisor would soften the meaning. Philip's daughter stood face to face with the woman he had chosen to exclude, and both understood that this had become personal. Anne opened the decree and read the restriction aloud. Camilla was denied access to Philip's personal archives, private correspondence, former apartments, ceremonial possessions, and every record placed under his family seal. A family seal was a private mark used to protect documents and possessions from ordinary household access. Any request made through Charles, the royal household, or another representative was to be refused. Camilla challenged the order at once. She said her present position had changed everything because she now supported the sovereign and carried responsibilities tied to the monarchy's future. The queen consort insisted that protecting continuity required access to records affecting Charles and his reign. Anne did not move. She replied that Philip had expected precisely that argument and had written the decree to survive every change of title. Camilla's restraint finally broke. She accused Anne of turning grief into authority and asked whether she had been waiting for a reason to humiliate her. The Princess Royal's expression cracked for only a second. Then she answered that humiliation would pass, but breaking a dead man's final boundary would stain the family permanently. Anne pressed harder. Camilla admitted through the private conversation that her office had submitted a request weeks earlier to examine letters concerning Charles's younger years. She claimed the purpose was to prepare an official family history, meaning a palace-approved account intended to shape how future generations understood the monarchy. Anne suddenly saw the timing. The sealed warning had surfaced, just as Camilla was trying to enter the collection again. Anne delivered the final blow. Every key, digital permission, staff authorization, and ceremonial clearance linked to Philip's legacy had already been cancelled. Camilla had not been summoned to debate what might happen. It had happened. Camilla shoved back her chair and declared that Charles would overturn the decree. Anne slid the second page forward and said, "Then he will have to overturn our father through me." Camilla left the room determined to reach the king, but the document waiting behind Anne's hand had been designed for that exact challenge, and it gave Philip's daughter more power than anyone in the palace had expected. By the time Camilla reached Charles, the palace machinery was already moving against her. Locks were being changed, permissions cancelled, and Philip's collection transferred under Anne's direct supervision. Yet the true shock was not how quickly the order took effect. It was why nobody, not even the king, could simply erase it. Philip had built the decree like a fortress, placing legal guardianship, family trust, and personal ownership beyond the reach of marital influence. Charles received her in silence. Camilla entered his study carrying anger, humiliation, and the brittle control of someone who refused to break in front of him. She told the monarch that the order had reduced her to an outsider inside her own household. The king listened without interrupting, but his failure to defend her immediately made every second feel like betrayal. Charles lifted the copied decree and read the legal foundation twice. Philip had separated his private archive from ordinary royal household property through a protected family trust, a formal arrangement that placed assets under named guardians and fixed rules. The letters, papers, possessions, and records belonged to a controlled legacy collection. That meant the late prince had retained the power to decide who could enter it, even after his death. Camilla watched his face change as he reached the second page. Anne was named principal guardian, the person holding final responsibility for enforcing the trust. Prince Edward had signed as secondary witness, while an independent solicitor served as legal administrator, meaning the lawyer had authority to apply the written conditions without palace interference. Charles could express a royal preference. He could not simply destroy a private command. Charles set the pages down with painful care. Philip's judgment wounded him as deeply as it wounded his wife. His father had not trusted him to separate love from duty. He had expected the king to place marital loyalty above the protection of family history, and he had built the entire decree to prevent that choice. The solicitor delivered the harshest warning through a documented legal briefing. Any attempt by Charles to pressure Anne, dismiss the guardians, or create an exemption would trigger an automatic transfer of the archive to an independent historical trust for 75 years. That external body would remove the collection from royal control entirely. Philip had made resistance more costly than obedience. Edward entered the study later and confirmed the truth in a private recorded conversation. Their father had been calm when he signed the order. He had not acted from passing anger. The younger brother said Philip feared that selected letters could be used to reshape the past, and he believed Anne alone would withstand the pressure to protect them. Charles remained alone after Edward left. He lifted the telephone to call his sister, then slowly lowered it before the line connected. Across the palace, Camilla received notice that her private secretary's archive credentials had been cancelled. She stared at the message and understood that her husband had not stopped the enforcement. The king's hesitation lasted only minutes, but inside the royal household it was interpreted as a decision, and the first consequences of Philip's decree began tearing through Camilla's position before she could recover. The fallout did not arrive through a public announcement. It came through doors that no longer opened. A keycard failed. A private secretary was turned away. A ceremonial inventory disappeared from Camilla's briefing papers. Each restriction seemed small on its own, but together they delivered an unmistakable message. Philip's final command was not symbolic. It was removing her, room by room, from a part of royal history she believed her title had finally secured. Camilla's office received the instructions before noon. Staff were told that neither she nor her representatives could enter Philip's former study, archive rooms, private storage areas, or ceremonial vault. A ceremonial vault was a protected space used to secure important royal objects and records. Every request involving his papers now had to pass through Anne, which meant access was no longer a matter of routine palace approval. It had become a personal barrier enforced by Philip's daughter. Senior courtiers understood why that mattered. Those rooms held more than old letters and possessions. They contained the private memory of Queen Elizabeth's marriage, Philip's judgments during royal crises, and records capable of shaping how future generations would understand the family. Whoever controlled that archive controlled part of the monarchy's hidden history. Camilla's exclusion, therefore, cut deeper than protocol. It told her that her title had limits inside the family's most guarded past. Camilla felt those limits herself after a scheduled meeting. She walked toward Philip's former corridor and pressed her access card against the reader. The light turned red. She tried once more. The same guard who had greeted her for years stepped forward and apologized, explaining that he had received direct orders not to admit her. The queen consort did not argue. She nodded, turned away, and carried the humiliation back through the palace in silence. Camilla entered her sitting room, removed her gloves, and dropped them onto a table. She remained standing. For the first time since receiving her title, she understood that public rank could not protect her from private rejection. Then she asked her secretary whether the archive contained Philip's written account of the Sandringham confrontation. The secretary admitted through a confidential office briefing that no complete inventory had been released. Camilla's urgency exposed the deeper fear. She was not merely losing access. She feared Philip had recorded a judgment powerful enough to define her legacy. Anne was already searching for that answer. She personally supervised the transfer of sealed boxes into a secure chamber and checked every item against the inventory. Near the bottom of the list, she found a separate envelope marked for Charles. The handwriting was unmistakable. Anne held it under the lamp but refused to break the seal. Her brother's name was written across the front. She sent one message: "Father left something for you." Minutes later, Charles replied that he would come alone. For the first time since the decree emerged, The struggle moved beyond Anne and Camilla, because Philip's final explanation was about to force Charles to confront the truth. Neither woman could settle for him. Charles entered the archive without Camilla, without advisors, and without the protection of his crown. Anne waited beside a single sealed envelope carrying their father's handwriting. For several seconds, neither sibling spoke. Then she placed it in front of him and stepped back. What Charles read did not attack his wife, question his reign, or demand obedience. It did something more painful. It explained why Philip believed his son would one day be unable to make this decision alone. Anne sat opposite him at a plain table inside the secure archive. She called him Charles, not the king. He called her Anne, not the Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter. Rank disappeared from the room. They were no longer sovereign and senior royal. They were Philip's children, facing a judgment their father had written because he believed love might one day make duty impossible. Charles broke the seal and began reading. Philip explained through the documented letter that the decree had never been written as revenge against Camilla. Its purpose was to protect private family testimony from anyone, a spouse, monarch, historian, or courtier, who might select certain words to improve one reputation by damaging another. The archive, he wrote, belonged to truth, not convenience. Charles reached the next passage and stopped. Philip described his son's loyalty as both his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. When love and duty collided, that loyalty could become blindness. The king removed his glasses and pressed his fingers against his eyes. His father had not doubted that he loved deeply. He had doubted whether that love would allow him to refuse Camilla. Anne watched him struggle and finally admitted her own pain. She confessed in their private conversation that enforcing the order had made her feel cruel. She had never wanted to humiliate the queen consort or stand against her brother. Charles lowered the letter and told her Philip had chosen her because she could survive being misunderstood when everyone else wanted peace. The letter then revealed what the decree truly protected. Philip had preserved messages from Queen Elizabeth describing private anguish during earlier family crises. He warned that her words must never be extracted, edited, or used to justify later decisions made by Charles or Camilla. The late queen's pain was not evidence for anyone's defense. Charles folded the letter carefully. The decree would stand. He would not challenge Anne, pressure the trustees, or demand a royal exemption. More importantly, he would tell his wife himself. Charles reached across the table and gripped his sister's hand. The gesture was brief, awkward, and deeply human. Then he carried Philip's letter toward Camilla's rooms. She saw his face and understood before he spoke. Charles's choice settled the battle inside the palace, but once the restriction escaped beyond those walls, the monarchy would have to face a harsher judgment from a public that saw Philip's decree as far more than a private family boundary. By sunrise, the secret was no longer contained. One newspaper carried a stark front page showing Philip's dark wax seal beside 4 words. His final word, no. Broadcasters interrupted their morning schedules. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, and every interpretation cut in a different direction. Some saw Anne as the fearless guardian of her father's wishes. Others saw Camilla being publicly reminded that acceptance had never meant unconditional belonging. The royal household moved quickly, but caution only deepened the storm. Its official statement confirmed that Prince Philip had created private access conditions for his personal archive, and that the family would honor them. The royal household meant the staff and offices supporting the monarch and senior royals in their official duties. Camilla's name was missing, yet that silence became louder than accusation. Everyone knew who had been denied entry. The media split the story in two. One broadcaster called the decree a dead patriarch's final boundary. Another described it as a modern test of whether royal spouses could ever fully enter the monarchy's private bloodline. The debate was no longer just about papers or locked rooms. It had become a battle over memory, marriage, inheritance, and whether a royal title could overcome private distrust. Anne watched the coverage before a scheduled engagement and showed no satisfaction. Praise made her uncomfortable because every headline turned family pain into victory. She told an aide during a documented palace conversation that no daughter should have to defend her father's trust against her own brother's household. The Princess Royal had enforced the decree, but she refused to celebrate what it had cost. Camilla faced the humiliation alone. She unfolded the morning newspaper at breakfast and froze at the image of Philip's seal. The Queen Consort folded the page inward until the headline disappeared, yet the movement betrayed how deeply the exposure had wounded her. She had survived years of judgment, but this rejection now carried the dead prince's signature. Outside Buckingham Palace, public feeling became impossible to ignore. One woman placed a handwritten card beside the gates reading, "A promise to the dead is still a promise." Nearby, another visitor left flowers for Camilla, with a note asking people not to confuse exclusion with guilt. The two gestures captured the division perfectly: loyalty to Philip on one side, sympathy for the woman shut out on the other. Charles ended the speculation during a recorded public engagement. Asked whether the decree had divided the family, the king paused and said, "My father's wishes will be respected." He did not blame Anne. He did not promise an appeal. His words confirmed that the decision was final. Camilla confronted him that evening and asked whether Philip had been right not to trust her. Charles answered that the question was no longer whether his father had been right, but whether they were strong enough to respect a boundary that caused them pain. She turned away, remained silent, then quietly asked to meet Anne one final time. The public had delivered its judgment in headlines and gestures, but the true verdict would be decided away from cameras, when Camilla faced Anne again, not to seize the archive, but to determine what dignity remained after the door had closed. Their second meeting contained none of the fury of the first. Camilla entered without advisors, and found Anne placing Philip's decree into a permanent protective case. The battle was already over. Charles had upheld the restriction, the trustees had secured the archive, and the palace had confirmed the decision. Yet Camilla had not come to fight again. She had come to ask whether Philip's final judgment would define her forever, and whether Anne could separate one locked door from the rest of their lives. Anne completed the final transfer of her father's papers under the Protected Family Trust, a legal arrangement that placed the archive under named guardians and permanent rules. The restrictions could not be weakened by a new title, a change of reign, or pressure from the royal household. Charles had formally accepted the arrangement. Edward had signed as confirming witness. Every request from Camilla's office had been withdrawn. There would be no appeal and no private exemption. Camilla faced Anne and asked for honesty. She said she could accept losing access, but she could not accept being remembered only as a threat in Philip's eyes. The Queen Consort wanted to know whether one request had erased everything else about her. Anne did not soften the truth. Her father had distrusted Camilla's wish to shape the historical record, but the decree restricted her actions. It did not define her entire human worth. Anne then released something she had carried since the first confrontation. She admitted that grief and resentment had entered the room with her. Protecting Philip's final wish did not require enjoying Camilla's humiliation, and she regretted the cruelty that anger had added to duty. The Princess Royal did not withdraw the boundary, but she removed vengeance from it. Camilla reached into her bag, placed the expired archive card on the table, and pushed it forward. She promised, through their private conversation, that she would never seek access again, directly or through Charles. The gesture ended the struggle. She finally accepted that belonging to the monarchy did not mean owning every part of its past. Anne took the card, but did not dismiss her. Philip's rooms would remain closed, she said, yet the family's future did not have to become another locked chamber. Camilla nodded. She had lost the argument, but not every chance of dignity. Anne sealed the decree inside its case, turned the key, and handed it to the archivist. Camilla waited beside her. They left together, not as close allies, but no longer fighting over the same door. Charles had proved that kingship sometimes meant refusing the person he loved. Anne had proved that duty meant fidelity to a promise. Camilla had proved that acceptance could carry limits without becoming total rejection. And so Philip's final command reached its absolute conclusion. The archive remained closed. The decree remained unbroken. And the crown moved forward, carrying a painful but unmistakable truth. Some boundaries protect a family precisely because no title is powerful enough to cross them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.